On the evening of October 18, 1831, in the quiet candlelit dining hall of the Bouligny plantation in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, parish officials watched in stunned silence as an enslaved man took the seat at the head of the table, a seat reserved only for the master of the estate. In November of 1853, Margaret Sinclair stood before Judge Harrison Caldwell in a closed courtroom in New Orleans and did something no white woman in Louisiana had ever done before. She sold her husband. Not a servant, not a worker, her legal husband, the man who owned her plantation, who controlled her inheritance, who had absolute authority over her body and her life for the past 2 years. She sold him to a man named Silas Grimwood, a cotton trader known throughout the Mississippi Delta for his particular appetites, the kind of appetites that made even hardened overseers turn away in disgust. What could drive a respectable plantation widow to commit an act so scandalous it was whispered about for generations? What had this man, this former slave-turned-husband, done to her behind the closed doors of Bel-Air Manor? And why did Margaret smile when she watched Nathaniel Cross, 42 years old, still handsome, still proud, led away in chains to Grimwood's riverboat? Before we uncover the twisted truth, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment with your state below. Because this story will take you to the darkest corners of the antebellum South, where the line between victim and monster blurred until no one could tell them apart. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Back to a time when Margaret Sinclair was still Margaret Ashford, when Nathaniel Cross was still someone else's property, and when Charles Sinclair believed himself to be an enlightened man. Back to the moment when 3 lives collided in ways none of them could have predicted, setting in motion a chain of events that would end in murder, manipulation, and a revenge so complete it would be whispered about in Louisiana, drawing rooms for generations. Spring 1846. Charleston, South Carolina. The kind of spring that arrived like a beautiful lie, the kind of spring that promised beauty but delivered suffocating heat. Magnolia bloomed along the Battery, their scent mixing with the salt air and the ever-present smell of the harbor. This was a city built on commerce and cotton, where fortunes rose and fell with market prices, and reputation was the only currency that truly mattered. The Ashford family occupied the upper echelons of Charleston society, not the very top. Those positions were reserved for families whose wealth stretched back generations, but close enough to see the summit. Thomas Ashford had built a respectable fortune in shipping and lumber. He owned Belle-Rive Plantation, 1,200 acres of moderately productive land in St. James Parish, Louisiana, worked by 93 enslaved people. His daughter Margaret was 23 years old in the spring of 1846. She had been educated by tutors, spoke French tolerably well, played piano adequately, and possessed what her mother called a practical disposition. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were too strong, her jaw too defined, her eyes too direct, but she carried herself with quiet confidence that some men found attractive and others found unsettling. Charles Sinclair found it attractive. He was 41 years old, recently widowed, owner of Oak Grove Plantation in St. James Parish, 800 acres adjacent to Belle-Rive. His first wife had died 18 months earlier of yellow fever, leaving no children. Charles needed an heir. The Ashfords needed a stronger connection to Louisiana's plantation economy. The match made perfect sense on paper. Margaret met Charles 3 times before the engagement was announced. She found him courteous, educated, and appropriately attentive. He spoke of books and music, of travel and architecture. He never raised his voice. He never drank to excess. He treated enslaved people with what he called Christian fairness, no unnecessary cruelty, adequate rations, medical care when needed. He seemed in every way acceptable. They married on October 12, 1846 at St. Michael's Church in Charleston. The ceremony was elegant, but not extravagant. Margaret wore cream silk and carried white roses. Charles looked distinguished in his wedding coat. The reception lasted until midnight. Everyone agreed it was a suitable match. Margaret moved to Oak Grove 3 weeks later. The plantation house was impressive. 2 stories, white columns, wide verandas, live oak trees created a canopy over the approach drive. The slave quarters sat a quarter-mile behind the main house, 32 cabins arranged in neat rows. The field stretched beyond that, cotton plants already harvested for the season, their empty stalks waiting for spring planting. Charles showed Margaret through her new home with evident pride, the parlor with its French wallpaper, the dining room with seating for 20, the library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, the master bedroom with its massive 4-poster bed and windows overlooking the river. "This is yours now," he said. "All of it. I hope you will be happy here." Margaret said she was sure she would be. For the first 3 months, she almost believed it. Charles maintained the patterns established during their courtship. He was polite, considerate, never demanding. He gave her freedom to manage the household as she saw fit. He listened when she spoke. He encouraged her to pursue her interests in reading and music. But there were things Margaret noticed, small things at fee. RST, the way Charles watched Nathaniel Cross. But who was Nathaniel Cross? And what was it about him that caught Charles Sinclair's attention in ways that would ultimately destroy everything? To understand that, we need to know where Nathaniel came from and what lay hidden beneath his careful composure. Nathaniel had been born in 1811 in Virginia, to parents who were enslaved on a tobacco plantation. His mother taught him to read in secret using scraps of newspaper and the Bible. His father taught him to hide what he knew. Intelligence in an enslaved man was dangerous. When Nathaniel was 16, his owner died and the estate was liquidated. Nathaniel was sold south, separated from his parents, transported in chains to Louisiana. He ended up at Oak Grove in 1827, purchased by Charles's father, Edmund Sinclair. Edmund had been a brutal man who believed enslaved people existed solely for profit extraction. He worked them from dawn to dusk, fed them minimally, punished infractions with the whip. Nathaniel learned to survive through silence and obedience. He also learned to read people, to understand what they wanted, to anticipate needs before they were spoken. When Edmund died in 1838, Charles inherited Oak Grove and immediately implemented reforms: better rations, no whipping without his personal approval, Sunday rest, medical care, a school for enslaved children. Nathaniel, by then 27 years old and showing intelligence that could not be entirely hidden, became the plantation's head carpenter. He supervised the maintenance of buildings, oversaw repairs, trained younger men in the trade. It was a position of relative privilege that came with slightly better housing and occasional small monetary gifts. Charles noticed him because Nathaniel was competent, articulate, and handsome in a way that made people stare. Tall, broad-shouldered, with features that suggested mixed answers. Try somewhere in his bloodline. Eyes that seemed to see more than they should. After Charles's first wife died, Nathaniel became more than the head carpenter. He became Charles's confidant, the person Charles spoke to when he needed to think aloud, the person who listened without judgment, who offered observations that were intelligent without being threatening. It was an unusual relationship, but not unheard of. Some plantation owners developed bonds with particularly trusted enslaved people. Charles told himself it was nothing more than that. A man finding companionship where he could, in a world where genuine connection was rare. He was lying to himself. Margaret realized it during her 4th month at Oak Grove. What exactly did Margaret realize? And how did that realization set in motion a chain of events that would end with Nathaniel crossing chains, Margaret smiling in a courtroom, and Charles Sinclair dead in his own bed? The answer lies in what happened one February evening in 1847. February 1847. Margaret came downstairs late one evening, unable to sleep. The house was quiet. The enslaved house staff long since retired to their quarters. She meant to fetch a book from the library. As she passed Charles's study, she heard voices, 2 men speaking in low tones. She recognized Charles immediately. The other voice took a moment: Nathaniel. This was not unusual. Charles often consulted with Nathaniel about plantation matters in the evening, but something in the tone made Margaret pause. Not the words which she could not quite hear, but the quality of the silence between them. She moved closer to the door, which stood slightly ajar. "You don't have to pretend," Charles was saying. "Not with me, not here." A long silence. "Then, Nathaniel, I don't know what you mean, sir." Charles laughed softly. "Don't you? I think you do. I think you've known for a while." Another silence. Margaret heard movement. She risked a glance through the gap. Charles stood close to Nathaniel, too close, his hand on Nathaniel's arm. "I would never force you," Charles said quietly. "You must know that. But I also think I hope that you feel something of what I feel." Nathaniel's face was carefully blank. "I feel gratitude, sir, for your kindness, for the opportunities you've given me. That's not what I'm asking about." Margaret pulled back from the door. Her heart pounded. She understood now. Charles's interest in Nathaniel was not intellectual curiosity or benevolent paternalism. She returned to her room and lay awake until dawn thinking. Charles Sinclair desired Nathaniel Cross in a place and time where such desire was unspeakable, where it could destroy a man's reputation completely. Charles had allowed himself to feel it, and now he was acting on it. Margaret felt many things that night: surprise, disgust, a strange sort of relief. Charles's emotional distance from her now made sense, but mostly she felt calculation. If Charles was compromised, if he was vulnerable, that could be useful. She began to watch them more carefully. Charles never forced himself on Nathaniel in any obvious way. He was too intelligent for that, too aware of the power dynamics. Instead, he created situations where Nathaniel had to be near him. He gave Nathaniel tasks that required evening consultations. He offered gifts, a new coat, books, small luxuries that Nathaniel could not refuse without insult. And Nathaniel, for his part, played along. He accepted the gifts. He came when summoned. He listened attentively. He spoke respectfully. But Margaret saw something in Nathaniel's eyes that Charles apparently did not. Cold, careful assessment. Nathaniel was not flattered by Charles's attention. He was calculating how to use it. One evening in March, Margaret arranged to encounter Nathaniel Arlo in the library. Charles was away in New Orleans on business. She found Nathaniel returning a book to the shelves. Charles allowed him to borrow from the collection. "Mr. Cross," she said. He turned, surprise flickering across his face before his expression settled into careful neutrality. "Mrs. Sinclair, I apologize for the intrusion. Mr. Sinclair said I could. I know what my husband told you," Margaret interrupted. "I want to know what you tell yourself." Nathaniel went very still. "I don't understand, ma'am." "I think you do." Margaret moved closer, her voice dropping. "My husband has developed an attachment to you, an inappropriate attachment. You must be aware of it." Nathaniel said nothing. "The question is," Margaret continued, "what do you intend to do with that knowledge?" For a long moment, Nathaniel studied her. Then, very carefully, "Why would I intend to do anything, ma'am? I am property. I have no agency. I exist to serve. Don't insult my intelligence," Margaret said flatly. "You're not a fool, and neither am I. My husband's infatuation makes him vulnerable. That gives you power. So I ask again, what do you intend to do with it?" Nathaniel's mask slipped just slightly. What Margaret saw beneath it chilled her. "I intend," he said quietly, "to survive and perhaps, if I'm fortunate, to improve my circumstances by manipulating my husband, by accepting what is offered and being grateful for it. Even though you don't want it, want has nothing to do with anything," Nathaniel said. "I stopped wanting things years ago. Now I simply endure and adapt." Margaret nodded slowly. "I understand more than you might think." She turned to leave, then paused. "A word of advice, Mr. Cross. My husband believes himself enlightened. He believes his feelings make him different from other plantation owners. That delusion is dangerous for both of you. Don't mistake his obsession for safety." Nathaniel's expression darkened. "I make no such mistake, ma'am." "Good." Margaret left the library, wondering if she had just made an ally or an enemy. The answer came 6 weeks later when everything shattered. What happened 6 weeks later? What event was so catastrophic that it transformed Margaret from a discontented wife into someone capable of ultimate revenge? And how did Nathaniel Cross go from being a victim of unwanted attention to becoming the instrument of Margaret's destruction? The truth is worse than you might imagine. April 1847. The air was thick with the smell of wisteria and impending storm. Spanish moss hung motionless from the oak trees, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Margaret had learned to read the weather in Louisiana, the peculiar stillness before violence, the way the light turned greenish and strange, the feeling that something terrible was coming, but you couldn't say exactly what or when. Charles returned from New Orleans in an expansive mood. Prices were good, buyers were plentiful. Oak Grove would have an excellent year. He hosted a dinner party to celebrate 8 couples from surrounding plantations, an elaborate meal imported wine. Margaret played the gracious hostess, overseeing every detail. Nathaniel served a table that evening, as he occasionally did when Charles wanted to showcase Oak Grove's refinement. An enslaved man who could serve wine properly, who understood French cuisine, who moved with quiet efficiency. It demonstrated Charles's success as a benevolent master. Margaret watched her husband watch Nathaniel. The way Charles's eyes followed him across the room, the way he found excuses to speak to him, the way his fingers brushed Nathaniel's hand when accepting a glass. No one else noticed. They were too busy eating and drinking and gossiping, but Margaret noticed. The party ended after midnight. The guests departed. The house staff cleaned and retired. Charles went to his study to smoke a final cigar. Margaret went upstairs and waited. An hour later, Charles came to bed. He smelled of tobacco and brandy. He was relaxed, contented. It was a successful evening, he said. You managed everything beautifully. Thank you. He extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, Margaret heard him settling into sleep. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow I take back control. The next morning, Margaret did something she had never done before. She went to the slave quarters. This was not unprecedented. Mistresses sometimes inspected quarters, checking for illness or ensuring adequate conditions. But Margaret had never shown much interest in that aspect of plantation management. She found Nathaniel outside his cabin, preparing to start the day's work. "Mr. Cross," she said, "I need to speak with you privately." They walked to the carpentry workshop, away from curious eyes and ears. Inside, Margaret turned to face him. "I need your help." Nathaniel's expression was wary. "With what, ma'am? With my husband? With ending his obsession with you before it destroys us all? How do you propose to do that?" Margaret told him her plan. It was simple and brutal. She would tell Charles that Nathaniel had made advances toward her, that he had become inappropriate, crossing boundaries that no enslaved man should cross with his master's wife. Charles would have to act. Anything less would make him look weak, cuckolded, unable to control his own household. Nathaniel would be sold, sent away. The problem would be solved. Nathaniel listened without expression. When Margaret finished, he said quietly, "That could get me killed." "It could," Margaret agreed, "but it won't. My husband is not violent by nature. He'll sell you somewhere decent, probably to a plantation where he has connections. You'll survive. And what do I get out of this? Why should I agree to be part of your solution? Because the alternative is worse." Margaret said, "My husband's interest in you is escalating. Eventually he'll do something undeniable, something that can't be ignored. When that happens, you'll be blamed regardless of your participation. Men like my husband always find ways to make it the slave's fault." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "No, I won't help you." His voice was flat. "You want to protect your marriage, your position. I understand that, but I won't be the tool you use to do it." Margaret felt a flash of anger. "You don't have a choice." "There is always a choice, Mrs. Sinclair. Sometimes the choice is between bad outcomes, but it's still a choice, and I choose not to participate in your plan." "Then you're a fool, perhaps, but I am not your puppet." Margaret left the workshop furious. Nathaniel had rejected her offer. Worse, he had done so with a calmness that suggested he knew something she didn't, that he had plans of his own, that he was not the pawn she had assumed him to be, but a player in his own right. She spent that evening in her room thinking about power, real power, versus the illusion of it. Charles thought he had power because he owned the plantation and everyone on it. But Charles was controlled by his obsession, which made him weak. Nathaniel appeared powerless because he was enslaved. But Nathaniel understood something fundamental about human nature. Desire created vulnerability, and vulnerability could be exploited. Where did that leave Margaret? She had money and property, but only through her husband. She had status, but only through marriage. She had been raised to believe that white womanhood was precious, protected, elevated above all others. But in practice, she was chatteled, just like the people Charles owned. Different degree, perhaps, different circumstances, certainly, but fundamentally the same. Her value determined by men, her choices limited by law and custom, her future dependent on forces beyond her control. It was a bitter realization, and it made her angry in ways she had never been angry before, not the hot, immediate anger of insult or injury, but cold, calculating fury that settled in her chest like ice and stayed there, hardening with each passing day. She was right to worry about Nathaniel's plans. That evening, Charles summoned her to his study. He looked grave, upset in a way she had rarely seen. "Margaret," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course. Has Nathaniel Cross ever behaved inappropriately toward you?" Margaret felt her stomach drop. "What? Answer the question. Has he made advances? Has he touched you? Has he said anything improper?" "No, never." "Why are you asking this?" Charles stood and paced to the window. "Because Nathaniel came to me this afternoon. He said he needed to confess something. He said that you came to him today and asked him to lie about his behavior toward you, that you wanted him to claim he had been inappropriate so I would sell him." Margaret's mind raced. That bastard. He had turned it around, anticipated her move, and countered it perfectly. "That's absurd," she said. "Is it?" Charles turned to face her. "Because Nathaniel also said you seemed disturbed by his presence here, that you had noticed my attention to him and found it troubling, that you wanted him gone because of what you suspected about my feelings." The room seemed to tilt. Nathaniel had told Charles everything, or enough of everything to make Margaret look like the villain. "I don't know what you're talking about," Margaret said carefully. "Don't lie to me." Charles's voice was sharp. "Not about this. Did you try to manipulate Nathaniel into lying? Did you threaten him?" "I was NG to protect you." "From what? From yourself?" Margaret's composure cracked. "From your obvious obsession with that man, from the way you look at him, the way you find excuses to be near him. Do you think I'm blind? Do you think the entire parish is blind?" Charles went pale. "That's ridiculous, is it?" Margaret stood. "Then tell me honestly, are you attracted to Nathaniel Cross? Silence, are you?" "My feelings are my own business," Charles said stiffly. "Not when they threaten our reputation, not when they make you vulnerable to gossip and speculation. I was trying to remove the source of temptation before you did something catastrophically stupid. By manufacturing false accusations, by trying to turn an innocent man into a scapegoat. He's not a man." Margaret's voice rose. "He's property, your property, and your inappropriate attachment to him is dangerous." Charles stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "Get out," he said quietly. "Charles, get out of my study now." Margaret left, her heart pounding with rage and fear. That night, Charles slept in his study. He did not speak to Margaret at breakfast. He left the house early and did not return until evening. When he did return, he brought Nathaniel with him. They went to the study and closed the door. Margaret stood in the hallway listening. "I owe you an apology," she heard Charles say. "My wife's behavior was inexcusable. I'm sorry you were put in that position. You have nothing to apologize for, sir." Nathaniel's voice was calm. Mrs. Sinclair was acting according to her understanding of the situation. "Nevertheless, I want you to know that your position here is secure. I won't allow anyone to threaten you." "Thank you, sir. I appreciate your protection." Something in Nathaniel's tone made Margaret's skin crawl. He had won completely. He had anticipated Margaret's move, turned it against her, and positioned himself as the innocent victim of a vindictive woman. Charles now felt guilty, protective, even more attached than before. Nathaniel had played them both perfectly, and Margaret realized with cold certainty that Nathaniel Cross was far more dangerous than she had imagined. But Margaret didn't know the half of it, because Nathaniel wasn't just manipulating Charles's feelings, he was building towards something much bigger, something that would make Margaret's attempted deception look like child's play. What was Nathaniel's real plan? And how did it involve the one thing Margaret valued above all else, Belarev plantation? June 1847. Margaret's father, Thomas Ashford, died suddenly of a heart attack. The news reached Oak Grove 3 days after the funeral. Margaret received it alone in the parlor, reading the letter from her mother with trembling hands. Thomas Ashford had been 62 years old, healthy, or so everyone thought. His death was unexpected, shocking. The will was simple. Belarev plantation went to Margaret as the only surviving child. The house in Charleston went to her mother. Various investments and bonds were divided between them. Margaret inherited 1,200 acres and 93 enslaved people. She was now a plantation owner in her own right. Under normal circumstances, this would have meant little. A married woman's property belonged to her husband. Charles would control Belarev as he controlled Oak Grove, but Thomas Ashford had included one unusual provision in his will. Perhaps he had sensed something about his daughter's marriage. Perhaps he simply wanted to protect his legacy. Belarev would remain in Margaret's name. Charles would manage it certainly, but ownership stayed with her. If Margaret died without children, Belair would go to her mother, not to Charles. It was an uncommon arrangement, but not illegal. Charles read the will with obvious irritation. "Your father didn't trust me," he said. "My father wanted to protect what he built by implying I would somehow mismanage it, by ensuring it stayed in family hands." Charles folded the letter with sharp movements. "Fine. I'll manage both plantations as I see fit, regardless of whose name is on the deed." Margaret said nothing, but she filed the information away. Belarev was hers, truly hers. That mattered more than Charles realized. Over the following weeks. Charles spent increasing time at Belarev, overseeing the integration of the two plantations. He took Nathaniel with him. Naturally, Nathaniel's carpentry skills were needed for repairs to Belarev's aging buildings. Margaret remained at Oak Grove, managing the household in Charles's absence. She was there when Nathaniel returned alone one August evening. He came to the main house and requested an audience with Mrs. Sinclair. Margaret received him in the parlor, curious and wary. "Mr. Cross, my husband is still at Belarev." "Yes, ma'am. He asked me to return with documents he forgot." Nathaniel held out a leather case. Margaret took it. "Thank you. You may go." "Actually, ma'am, I was hoping we could speak about a matter of mutual interest." Nathaniel's expression was carefully neutral concerning your inheritance and your husband's plans for it. Margaret felt a chill. "What plans?" "Perhaps we could speak somewhere more private." "The study?" Against her better judgment, Margaret agreed. In Charles's study, Nathaniel closed the door and turned to face her. "Your husband intends to challenge your father's will," he said without preamble. "That's impossible. The will is legal." "Legal? Yes. But Charles has been consulting with attorneys in New Orleans. He believes he can make a case that your father was not of sound mind when he made that provision, that the unusual nature of leaving property in a married woman's name suggests mental instability." "Ma." Garrett felt her blood run cold. "That's absurd, perhaps, but Charles is determined. He wants full control of Belarev. He's already begun the process." "How do you know this?" "Because he discusses everything with me." Nathaniel's smile was thin. "He talks to me more than he talks to you, Mrs. Sinclair. I know his business dealings, his legal strategies, his financial situation. I know everything." "Why are you telling me?" "Because we could help each other." Margaret stared at him. "Help each other? How?" Nathaniel moved to Charles's desk and sat in his chair, an act of incredible audacity for an enslaved man. "Your husband is obsessed with me," he said calmly. "You know it. I know it. He believes he loves me. He believes that once he has complete control of both plantations, once his position is absolutely secure, he can somehow make our relationship more open. Not public, of course, but less hidden. Margaret felt sick. That's insane. Yes, but it's what he believes, and he's taking steps to make it happen, including removing any obstacles to his complete control, like your ownership of Bel Air. What do you want? Freedom. Nathaniel leaned forward. I want you to manumit me. Grant me my freedom legally. Charles would never do it. He's too attached. But you could. You own Bilar. You could transfer me to Bellarive's ownership, then free me there. In exchange for what? In exchange for information, everything Charles is planning, every legal strategy, every financial move. I'll tell you everything he tells me. You can protect your inheritance, and I can escape. Margaret studied him. Why should I trust you? Because I have no reason to lie. If Charles succeeds in taking Bel Air, I gain nothing. I remain enslaved to a man whose obsession with me is dangerous. If you maintain control of Bellarive, you can free me and I disappear. Everyone wins except Charles. It was logical, cold, manipulative. Self-interested but logical. I need time to think, Margaret said. Of course. But don't take too long. Charles is moving quickly. Nathaniel stood and left the study, bold as you please, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts. For 3 days, Margaret considered the offer. Nathaniel was clearly manipulating her just as he manipulated Charles. He was using their conflict for his own benefit, but his information was valuable, and the idea of thwarting Charles's plans appealed to something dark in Margaret's heart. On the 4th day, she made her decision. She went to Bellarive while Charles was in New Orleans. She found Nathaniel working on repairs to the overseer's house. I accept your offer, she said. Information for freedom. Nathaniel nodded. When? After I've secured Bellarive against my husband's legal challenge. That will take months, perhaps a year. Can you wait? I've waited my entire life, Mrs. Wet Sinclair. I can wait another year. They shook hands. A white plantation owner and an enslaved man making a deal that violated every social norm of their world. Margaret had no idea she was sealing her own doom, because Nathaniel Cross had lied about one crucial thing. He didn't want freedom, or rather, he wanted something much more than freedom. He wanted revenge. He wanted power. He wanted to destroy Charles Sinclair completely, and he had just convinced Margaret to give him the tools to do it. What was Nathaniel's real plan? And how did it end? With Charles dead and Margaret desperate enough to sell her own husband to sexual slavery. Over the following months, Nathaniel fed Margaret information. Charles was indeed consulting attorneys about challenging the will. He had borrowed money to finance the legal challenge. He was also making questionable investments using Oak Grove as collateral. Margaret used the information to protect herself. She hired her own Atto, Rainey in Charleston. She quietly documented Charles's spending. She began moving assets out of his reach. Charles noticed nothing. He was too focused on his plans, too confident in his position, too distracted by his obsession with Nathaniel. By February 1848, the situation had escalated. Charles had become bolder in his attention to Nathaniel. He gave him increasingly lavish gifts. He spent hours alone with him under increasingly flimsy pretexts. He had moved Nathaniel from the slave quarters into a room in the main house, officially as a valet, unofficially as something much more troubling. Margaret watched it all with growing disgust and calculation. Then, in March, everything changed. Charles's legal challenge to Thomas Ashford's will was rejected. The judge found no evidence of mental instability. Bellarive remained Margaret's property. Charles was devastated, furious. He drank heavily for 3 days. On the 4th day, he made a decision. He called Margaret to his study. I need money, he said without preamble. Significant money. The legal challenge cost more than I anticipated. I've made investments that require additional capital. I need you to agree to mortgage Bellarive. No, Margaret said flatly. It's not a request. It is actually Bellarive is mine. You can't mortgage it without my signature. Charles's face darkened. You're my wife. What's yours is mine. Not according to my father's will. Not according to Louisiana law regarding separately inherited property. The law can be challenged. You tried that. You lost. Charles stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. You will sign the mortgage papers, Margaret, one way or another. No, I won't. Then you leave me no choice. Charles left the study. Margaret heard him shouting for Nathaniel. An hour later, Charles returned with documents. His attorney was with him, a man named Crawford, who specialized in property law. Sign thee, Charles said, throwing the papers on the desk. Margaret read them. It was not a mortgage. It was a transfer of ownership from Margaret to Charles, complete and absolute. I won't, she said. You will. Charles's voice was cold. Because if you don't, I will testify in court that you are mentally unstable, that you suffer from hysteria and delusions, that you are unfit to manage property. I will have you declared incompetent and committed to an asylum, and then I will become the legal manager of your estate regardless. Margaret felt true fear for the first time. You can't do that. I can and I will. Crawford has already prepared the petition. I have witnesses ready to testify to your erratic behavior. Your attempt to manipulate Nathaniel into lying, your paranoid accusations about my business dealings, your refusal to perform your welly duties. Margaret looked at the attorney. Crawford met her gaze without flinching. He would do it. Charles would do it. She had no choice. With shaking hands, Margaret signed the transfer papers. Charles smiled. Thank you, my dear. I knew you'd be reasonable. That night, Margaret lay awake planning murder. She could poison Charles. It would be easy. Arsenic in his food, something slow-acting that mimicked natural illness. She would inherit everything as his widow. But even as she planned it, she knew she wouldn't. Murder was too risky. If caught, she would hang, and she wasn't entirely certain she could live with the guilt. There had to be another way. The answer came 3 weeks later in the most unexpected form. Charles Sinclair died on April 15, 1848. He died in his sleep, apparently from heart failure. The doctor examined him and found no suspicious circumstances. He was 43 years old, somewhat young for heart failure, but these things happened. Margaret grieved appropriately. She wore black. She accepted condolences. She made funeral arrangements. And then she read Charles's will. It had been changed 2 weeks before his death. Charles left Oak Grove to a distant cousin in Virginia. Various smaller properties went to other relatives, but the bulk of his estate, including Bellere, which he had acquired from Margaret, went to Nathaniel Cross with one condition. Nathaniel was to be manumitted immediately upon Charles's death. He would become a free man and the owner of Bellere plantation. Additionally, the will specified that Nathaniel was to marry Margaret Sinclair within 6 months of Charles's death, or the inheritance would be void. Margaret read the will 3 times, unable to believe what she was seeing. Charles had left everything to Nathaniel, and he had arranged for Nathaniel to marry Margaret, ensuring that Charles's beloved would be taken care of, protected, elevated in status. It was insane, grotesque, legally dubious, but it was valid. Charles's attorney confirmed it. The will was properly executed. The provision was unusual but not illegal. Nothing prohibited a man from freeing an enslaved person in his will and leaving that person property. The marriage clause was more problematic, but Crawford believed it would stand. Margaret could challenge the will, of course, but that would take years and considerable money, and in the meantime she had nothing. Charles had transferred Bellerive to himself, then left it to Nathaniel. Oak Grove went to the cousin. Margaret was left with nothing but her widow's thirds, a small allowance from Charles's remaining estate, unless she married Nathaniel. Then she would regain everything. Bellerive would belong to her husband, and under the law, she would have rights to it again. It was a trap, a perfect calculated trap, and Nathaniel had set it. But how had Nathaniel arranged all this? How had he convinced Charles to write that will? And what happened due? Ring those 2 years of forced marriage that drove Margaret to finally take her terrible revenge. The truth is worse than anything you've imagined. Nathaniel came to Margaret 1 week after the funeral. He found her in Bellerive's parlor, surrounded by legal documents. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said quietly, "we need to discuss the situation." The situation? Margaret's laugh was bitter. "You mean the trap you've caught me in? I mean the inheritance, the will, the marriage requirement. How did you do it? How did you convince Charles to write that will?" Nathaniel sat uninvited. "I didn't convince him of anything. I simply listened. Charles talked endlessly about his fears, his dreams, his desires. He wanted to take care of me. He wanted to ensure my future. He was dying." "Mrs. Sinclair, he knew it." Margaret stared. "What? The heart condition?" It was real. Charles had been seeing doctors for months. They told him he had perhaps a year, maybe less. "He didn't tell you because he didn't want your pity, but he told me everything." Margaret felt the room spin. Charles was dying, yes, and he spent his final months arranging his affairs, including ensuring that I would be free and provided for. The marriage requirement was his idea, not mine. He thought it would protect us both. You would have security, I would have status. It's obscene, perhaps, but it's done, and now we have a choice. We can marry and share control of Bellerive, or we can let it go to the alternate beneficiary named in the will, a missionary organization in Boston that Charles supported. Either way, you lose everything your father built. Margaret closed her eyes. "I won't marry you. Then you'll have nothing." Nathaniel's voice was flat. "No property, no income beyond your widow's allowance, no position in society. You'll be dependent on your mother's charity for the rest of your life. Better that than marrying a former slave. That's your final decision." Margaret opened her eyes and looked at him. Really looked at him. Nathaniel was 42 years old. Handsome, intelligent, utterly calm, a man who had survived slavery through manipulation and calculation. A man who had played Charles perfectly, who had maneuvered Margaret into an impossible position, who now sat in her parlor as if he owned it, which legally he did. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. 6 months from Charles's death. If we're not married by October 15th, the property goes to the missionaries. And if we marry, what then? Then we're business partners, nothing more. I have no interest in forcing my company on you beyond what's legally necessary. We marry, we manage Belair together. We live separate lives as much as possible. You expect me to believe you'll demand nothing? I expect you to believe that I want freedom and security more than I want revenge or domination." Nathaniel stood. "Think about it, Mrs. Sinclair. You have time, but not much." He left her alone with her impossible choice. For 5 months, Margaret resisted. She consulted attorneys. She explored legal challenges. She wrote to relatives begging for loans. Nothing worked. On October 10, 1848, Margaret Sinclair married Nathaniel Cross in a private ceremony with only the required witnesses present. The ceremony took place in Judge Crawford's office, not a church. No flowers, no music, no celebration. Just words read from a book, signatures on a document, and the feeling of a door slamming shut. Margaret wore black, still in mourning. Technically, though, the real mourning was for herself, for the life she might have had, for the choices that had been taken from her, for the trap she had no way to escape. Nathaniel wore a new suit purchased with money that had been Charles's, that was now his. He looked handsome, composed, completely in control. When he spoke his vows, his voice was steady. When he looked at Margaret, his eyes revealed nothing. The witnesses were Judge Crawford and his clerk. Both men looked uncomfortable. They had facilitated something that felt wrong, even by the twisted standards of their time. A white woman marrying a man who had been enslaved just months earlier. A marriage built on manipulation and legal technicality rather than any pretense of affection. After the ceremony, Nathaniel offered Margaret his arm. She took it because she had to. They walked out of Crawford's office as husband and wife, legally bound, their futures tangled together in ways that would destroy them both. It was the most humiliating day of her life, and the worst part was knowing it was only the beginning. The marriage night, Nathaniel did not touch her. He kept his promise. They had separate bedrooms, separate lives. For 2 weeks, Margaret thought it might be bearable. Then Nathaniel began to show his true face. It started small. Nathaniel ordering the house staff without consulting Margaret. Nathaniel making decisions about plantation operations without her input. Nathaniel sitting at the head of the table, occupying Charles's chair, using Charles's office. When Margaret objected, Nathaniel reminded her, "I own this property. You are my wife. Under the law, I control everything. We agreed to partnership." Margaret said, "We agreed to marriage. Partnership was your interpretation." The changes escalated. Nathaniel started bringing associates to Belle Rive, free men of color from New Orleans, former enslaved people who had bought their freedom, businessmen who operated in the complicated racial territory between white and black in Louisiana. They came for dinner. They stayed for drinks. They treated Nathaniel as an equal. White neighbors noticed. They stopped calling on Margaret. Invitations dried up. The social isolation was absolute. Worse than the social humiliation was Nathaniel's personal behavior. He never forced himself on Margaret sexually. That would have been too obvious, too illegal, even in their twisted situation. Even in a world where husbands had legal rights over their wives' bodies, forcing himself on her would have given her ammunition, created evidence, provided grounds for legal action. Instead, he used psychological torture that left no marks, created no evidence, gave her nothing she could take to authorities. He would enter her room without knocking. Early morning, late night, any time he chose, he would stand there watching her dress or undress, or simply sit reading, saying nothing, just watching with those calculating eyes until she felt her skin crawl, until she wanted to scream at him, to leave, but knew that was exactly what he wanted, her loss of composure, her acknowledgement of his power. He would appear behind her in hallways close enough that she could feel his breath on her neck, smell the tobacco and whiskey, sense his presence like a weight. She would freeze, heart pounding, waiting for him to speak or touch or do something. But he would just stand there for a moment, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute, and then walk away without a word, leaving her shaking, angry at herself for being frightened, angry at him for making her feel this way. He would touch her in passing, a hand on her shoulder as he moved past her chair, fingers brushing her arm when he reached for something. Nothing that anyone watching would consider inappropriate. A husband touching his wife, perfectly normal, but the touch would linger just slightly too long. The pressure would be just slightly too firm, and Margaret would understand the message. "I can touch you whenever I want. Your body is mine now, even if I choose not to exercise that right." At meals, he would talk about Margaret as if she were that present, discussing her with his guests, the free men of color he brought from New Orleans, the former enslaved people who had bought their freedom and now came to Bel Air for dinner and drinks. He would comment on her coldness, her prejudices, her inability to adapt to their new situation. "My wife," he would say, and the words were always edged with mockery, "still believes the world should function according to Charleston drawing room rules. She hasn't yet understood that those rules only existed because people like me enforced them, and now I choose not to." The guests would laugh nervously. Some found it amusing, the inverted power dynamic the white woman brought low. Others seemed uncomfortable, but said nothing. Margaret would sit there, face burning, unable to respond without making it worse. If she objected, Nathaniel would turn his attention fully on her, ask her in that calm, reasonable voice to explain what exactly was inappropriate about his comments, and she would have no answer that didn't sound like racism, classism, an inability to accept her new reality. Sometimes late at night, Margaret would hear sounds from down the hall. Nathaniel with women, free women of color from New Orleans who came to visit. Women who laughed and talked, and clearly came to his bed willingly. Margaret would lie in her room listening to the sounds carry through the old house. Conversation, laughter, other noises that made her stomach turn. Everyone in the house heard it. The enslaved people working in the kitchen, the house staff, the field hands who came inside for evening tasks. Everyone knew that the master brought women to his bed while his wife slept alone down the hall. It was the final humiliation. Not just that Nathaniel didn't want her, but that he made sure everyone knew it, that he demonstrated publicly that she had no value to him except as a legal convenience, a means to maintain control of the property. The enslaved people at Belle Rive were confused and frightened. Their new master was a former slave. The social order had inverted. Some adapted, others resisted quietly. A few ran away. Nathaniel handled it with cold efficiency. Runaways were pursued and returned. Resistors were sold. Within months, Belariv's enslaved population had been almost entirely replaced with people Nathaniel brought in, individuals who owed loyalty to him, not to the old order. Margaret was trapped. She couldn't leave. She had nowhere to go, no money of her own. She couldn't fight back. Nathaniel controlled everything legally. She couldn't even complain to authorities. Who would believe a white woman claiming abuse from her own husband? Especially when that husband was a former slave who had somehow maneuvered himself into owning a plantation. The white community regarded the entire situation with horrified fascination. They whispered that Margaret must have been complicit somehow, that she had encouraged Charles's unnatural affections, that she deserved what she got. No one helped her. By November 1850, Margaret had lost almost everything that made her herself, her pride, her dignity, her hope. But she hadn't lost her intelligence. She began to plan. What did Margaret discover that finally gave her leverage? What secret had Nathaniel been hiding that was even darker than everything he'd already done? And how did that discovery lead to the moment we began with? Margaret standing in a courtroom selling her own husband into the kind of slavery he thought he'd escaped. December 1850. Margaret was searching through Nathaniel's desk for bank documents. She needed to understand their financial situation if she was going to plan an escape. She found something else instead. Letters hidden in a false bottom of one of the drawers. The first was from Charles's. Attorney Crawford, dated March 1848. 1 month before Charles died, the correspondence detailed payments Crawford had received from Nathaniel over the preceding year. Payments for legal services, for drafting documents, for ensuring Charles's will was written exactly as Nathaniel wanted it. Margaret's hands shook as she read. The second letter was worse. It was from a doctor in New Orleans, also dated March 1848. It confirmed that Charles Sinclair had purchased digitalis from the doctor's office on 3 occasions in February and early March. Digitalis, the letter noted, was useful for heart conditions in small doses. In larger doses, it could cause heart failure. But Charles hadn't purchased the digitalis. Someone had purchased it using Charles's name and account. The signature on the purchase records Margaret saw was not Charles's handwriting, it was Nathaniel's. Margaret sat in the dark office pieces clicking together. Nathaniel had killed Charles slowly, carefully over weeks, using poison that mimicked natural heart disease, while simultaneously convincing Charles to write a will that left everything to Nathaniel. Charles's heart condition had been manufactured. His death had been murder, and Nathaniel had gotten away with it perfectly until now. Margaret took the letters. She hid them in her own room in a place Nathaniel would never think to look. Then she began planning in earnest. She couldn't go to authorities with evidence of murder. No court would take a white woman's accusation against her black husband seriously. The racial dynamics made it impossible. They would assume she was lying to escape her marriage, trying to regain property through false accusations. But Margaret didn't need to prove murder. She needed to prove something else entirely. Over the next months, Margaret did research. She corresponded quietly with attorneys in Charleston and New Orleans. She studied Louisiana law regarding marriage, property, and slavery. She found what she needed in a nearly forgotten statute from 1806. The law stated that any free person of color who had been manumitted under false pretenses could have that manumission revoked. If it could be proven that the person had obtained freedom through fraud, criminal activity, or deception of the person granting freedom, they could be returned to slave status. Charles's will had freed Nathaniel. But if Charles had been deceived about Nathaniel's character, if Charles had not known he was freeing his own murderer, then the manumission could be challenged. It was a long shot, but it was possible. Margaret needed one more piece, proof that Nathaniel had systematically deceived Charles, that he had pretended feelings he didn't have, manipulated Charles's affections, cultivated the obsession for his own benefit. She found it in Nathaniel's journals. He kept them in his office, not particularly well hidden. Perhaps he thought Margaret would never dare look. Perhaps he was arrogant enough to believe it didn't matter if she found them. The journals were damning, meticulous records of Nathaniel's manipulation, His observations about Charles's weaknesses, his strategies for encouraging Charles's obsession, his plans for freedom and revenge, and there in entries from early 1848, his notes about poison, about dosages, about symptoms, about how long Charles would likely last. Nathaniel had documented his own crime. Margaret copied the relevant passages. She compiled the evidence carefully, the letters from Crawford, the digitalis purchases, excerpts from the journals. Then she went to New Orleans. She met with Judge Harrison Caldwell, one of the most respected jurists in Louisiana. She laid out her case carefully. Nathaniel Cross was not legally free. His manumission was based on fraud. Charles S. Sinclair had freed him, believing Nathaniel to be a loyal, grateful, devoted man. In reality, Nathaniel was a manipulator and a murderer. The will should be voided. Nathaniel should be returned to slave status. Judge Caldwell reviewed the evidence. He was skeptical at first. The case was unprecedented. But the documentation was compelling, the journals especially. In August 1853, Judge Caldwell issued his ruling. The manumission of Nathaniel Cross was void. He was to be returned to slave status immediately. As Margaret's property, she was his widow after all, and inherited any property her deceased husband had owned at the time of his death. Nathaniel was arrested at Bellerive. He fought like a wild animal. It took 5 men to subdue him. They brought him to New Orleans in chains. Margaret met him at the courthouse. "You think you've won," Nathaniel said. His voice was horror from shouting, from fighting against the chains. The iron had already left marks on his wrists, red welts that would become scars. "You think this changes anything?" "It changes everything," Margaret replied quietly. She kept her voice level, calm, the way Nathaniel had always kept his voice when he was tormenting her. She wanted him to hear in her tone the same cold control he had used on her for 2 years. "You spent 2 years making me feel powerless, making me feel like property in my own home, making me understand what it means to have no agency, no choices, no escape. Now you understand exactly how that feels. I'll challenge this. I'll find attorneys." You'll do nothing," Margaret interrupted, "because I'm selling you today, right now, and the man I'm selling you to is named Silas Grimwood." She watched the color drain from Nathaniel's face, watched him understand. Grimwood's reputation was known even in New Orleans. Everyone knew what kind of man he was, what he did to the enslaved men he purchased, why he paid premium prices for handsome men in their prime. "No." Nathaniel's voice cracked. "You can't." "I already have," Margaret said. "The sale is complete. The money has changed hands. You belong to him now. Mr. Grimwood is waiting outside to take possession of his property." She leaned close, dropping her voice so only Nathaniel could hear. "You took everything from me, my husband. And yes, Charles was a fool and a killer, but he was my husband and you murdered him. You took my property, my dignity, my life. For 2 years you made me understand what it means to be powerless, to be used, to be treated as less than human, to have someone control your body, your time, your very existence, and to have no recourse, no escape, no hope." She straightened, looking down at him. "Now you get to experience exactly what you did to me every day, every night, for the rest of your life, however long that is. I made very sure to research Mr. Grimwood's preferences. I made very sure he understood exactly what kind of attention you would require. He was quite enthusiastic about the purchase. He said you were exactly his type." Nathaniel was shaking now from rage, from fear. Margaret didn't know and didn't care. "You're a monster," he whispered. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "You made me one. You and Charles, between you, you showed me that the only way to survive in this world is to become as ruthless as the people who hurt you, that mercy is weakness, that compassion is vulnerability, that the only power that matters is the power to destroy." She turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Mr. Grimwood lives deep in the bayou country, isolated. No neighbors for miles, no one to hear anything, no one to witness anything. If you try to run, he's authorized to take whatever measures he deems necessary to ensure your compliance. I made sure that was written into the sale agreement. Goodbye, Mr. Cross. Or should I say, goodbye, Nathaniel. You're not Mr. Anything anymore. You're just another piece of property. Just like you made me feel. just like the people you were willing to sacrifice to get your freedom. I hope every night with Grimwood teaches you something about what you did to me. I hope you remember my face. I hope you die knowing that I won." Margaret watched as they led Nathaniel away. He was shouting, threatening, pleading. She felt nothing. She felt nothing. Judge Caldwell approached his cross. "Or is it Miss Sinclair now?" "I'm returning to my maiden name." Margaret said, "I am Margaret Ashford, and I would like to reclaim Berriff Plantation, which is rightfully mine. Of course, I'll have the paperwork drawn up. Thank you, Your Honor." Margaret left the courthouse. Outside, New Orleans was bright and busy. The sun was shining, the air smelled of flowers and river water. She took a deep breath. For the first time in 5 years, Margaret Ashford was free. Margaret never remarried. She managed Bel Air for 32 more years, becoming one of the few women plantation owners in Louisiana. She was not particularly kind to the enslaved people she owned, but she was not unnecessarily cruel either. She was practical, efficient, cold. She never spoke about Nathaniel Cross or Charles Sinclair. When asked about her past, she would say only that she had been widowed twice and preferred not to dwell on unhappy memories. Silas Grimwood kept Nathaniel for 11 years. He worked him in the fields during the day and used him for other purposes at night. Nathaniel never stopped trying to escape. He was caught and punished repeatedly, whipped, branded, kept in chains. In 1864, when Union troops liberated Grimwood's plantation during the Civil War, they found Nathaniel in a locked shed. He was 53 years old, skeletal, covered in scars, half mad from years of abuse. They freed him, gave him papers, sent him north. Nathaniel disappeared into history. No records exist of what happened to him after 1864. Margaret died in 1885 at the age of 62. She left Bellerive to a women's educational foundation, stipulating that it be used to establish a school for girls, white girls only, the will specified, in language typical of its time. The school operated until 1923, when it was absorbed into the Louisiana public school system. The plantation house still stands, though it's been converted into a museum. Tours focus on the architecture and the agricultural history. They don't mention Margaret Ashford's marriages. They don't talk about Nathaniel Cross. Those stories were deliberately suppressed, considered too scandalous for public consumption. The documentation exists, though, in archives, court records, property transfers. The evidence Margaret compiled. Nathaniel's journals donated anonymously to the Louisiana Historical Society in 1891. This is how we know what happened. This is how we know that in 1853 a woman stood in a courtroom and sold her husband into slavery, that she did it with full knowledge of what he would suffer, that she did it for revenge. Was Margaret a victim? Yes. She was trapped, abused, humiliated, tormented for 2 years by a man who had killed her first husband and manipulated his way into her life. Was she also a monster? Also, yes. She condemned Nathaniel to sexual slavery and brutal abuse, knowing exactly what would happen to him. She used the evil system of slavery itself as her weapon of revenge. Was Nathaniel a victim? He was enslaved, abused, caught in a system that denied his humanity. He survived through manipulation and murder. Was he also a monster? Without question, he poisoned Charles. He tortured Margaret psychologically. He showed no remorse for any of it. This is a story without heroes, only people broken by a system built on human suffering. People who adapted to that system by becoming monsters themselves. If you made it this far, take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments. Who do you think was more at fault? And remember, this isn't just a historical curiosity. This is what happens when human beings are treated as property, when power is absolute and unchecked, when survival requires becoming the very thing you hate. These dynamics still exist, not in the same form perhaps, but wherever there's power imbalance, wherever there's exploitation, wherever people are dehumanized, the same patterns emerge. Margaret and Nathaniel's story is a warning about what we're capable of when we're desperate enough, when we're hurt enough, when we decide that revenge matters more than humanity. Leave your comments below. And remember, History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the darkness we're all capable of so we can choose something. Jean-Baptiste operated the plantation for 4 years before selling it and moving to New Orleans. Marie remarried a merchant in 1836, but the scandal lived on for decades. Plantation gossip called it the dinner that shamed St. Landry.